Some moments are supposed to last forever, but the stage only holds you for as long as the music plays. Sheila E. had been behind a drum kit since she was 5 years old, taught by her father Pete Escovedo, one of the greatest percussionists in Latin jazz history. By the time she was 27, her hands moved faster than thought, her rhythm so complex that other musicians would stop mid-song just to watch her work. She'd played with everyone: Marvin Gaye, Lionel Richie, Diana Ross. But nothing in her career had prepared her for Prince. He'd discovered her in 1983 after seeing her perform with her father at a club in Oakland. Within months, she was in the studio recording The Glamorous Life, a song that would hit the top 10 and establish her as more than just a session player. She was a star now, headlining her own shows, with Prince's guidance turning her raw talent into something otherworldly. But somewhere between the recording sessions and the tour rehearsals, something else had happened. They'd fallen in love, or at least Sheila had. With Prince, it was always hard to tell. He moved through relationships the way he moved through genres, sampling and blending and experimenting, never quite settling into anything that felt permanent. But with Sheila, it seemed different. He wrote songs for her. He stayed up all night listening to her ideas. He told her she understood music in a way no one else did, that she could hear the spaces between the notes where most people only heard silence. And then, on that February night in 1985, he made it official. He proposed to her on stage in front of thousands, and for one perfect moment, Sheila believed that love could actually be as grand as the music they made together. The crowd's cheers felt like validation, like the universe itself was applauding their connection. But what Sheila didn't know, what she couldn't have known in that spotlight-drenched moment of pure joy, was that for Prince, the stage wasn't where real life happened. It was where real life was transformed into something else entirely, something beautiful and devastating and impossible to hold on to. And by the time she figured that out, it would already be too late. If you want to discover the untold stories behind music's greatest legends, subscribe now and join thousands who never miss an episode. The stone facade of the club on Broadway Avenue in Oakland didn't look like the kind of place where destinies changed hands. But that's exactly what happened on a humid night in June 1983. Prince had driven up from Los Angeles specifically to see Pete Escovedo perform, the legendary Latin jazz percussionist whose rhythms had influenced everyone from Santana to Tito Puente. What Prince didn't expect was the woman behind the timbales, moving with such precision and power that even the seasoned musicians on stage kept glancing back at her, trying to figure out how she made it look so effortless. Sheila Escovedo was 26 years old, and she'd been performing professionally since she was a teenager. But there was something different about her presence that night. Prince watched from a corner table, his sunglasses on even in the dim club lighting. And when the set ended, he didn't wait for an introduction. He walked straight to the backstage area and told Pete Escovedo that his daughter was going to be a star, and that if she was interested, he wanted to work with her immediately. Meeting Prince in person wasn't what Sheila expected. He wasn't cocky or arrogant. Instead, he asked her about her technique, about how she approached polyrhythms, about whether she'd ever experimented with electronic drum pads. They talked for 2 hours that night, standing in a narrow hallway behind the club while the crew packed up equipment around them. And by the end of it, Sheila had agreed to fly down to Los Angeles the following week to record some demos. She'd already decided she was going to say yes the moment he started asking about the spaces between the notes, because that's what separated real musicians from people who just played instruments. Real musicians understood that silence was just as important as sound, and Prince understood that better than anyone she'd ever met. The recording session for what would become The Glamorous Life started at midnight and didn't end until the sun was coming up over Sunset Sound Studios. When Prince asked her to re-record a percussion part for the 7th time because the attack on the 3rd beat wasn't quite sharp enough, she didn't get frustrated. She understood what he was hearing, that tiny imperfection that would have been invisible to 99% of listeners, but that would have bothered him forever if they'd left it in. That's when Prince knew he'd found something rare. Most artists wanted to work with him because of his fame, but Sheila wanted to work with him because she was just as obsessive about getting the music right as he was. She heard the same details he heard. She cared about the same things he cared about. And when they finally got that percussion part perfect on the 8th take, Prince looked at her through the control room glass and nodded, just once. And Sheila felt something shift between them that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with recognition. The Glamorous Life was released in April 1984, climbing to number 7 on the Billboard Hot 100. It established Sheila as a solo artist in her own right and proved that Prince's genius wasn't just in his own performances, but in his ability to see potential in other people and draw it out of them. Prince designed her entire stage show, from the lighting cues to the costume changes, but he was smart enough to step back and let her be the center of attention. He understood something crucial about performance that most producers missed. You couldn't make someone a star by standing next to them in the spotlight. You had to build them their own spotlight and then get out of the way. And that's exactly what he did for Sheila, even as the professional relationship was slowly evolving into something neither of them had quite named yet. But both of them could feel building with every passing week. By the time the Purple Rain Tour kicked off in November 1984, Sheila E. was opening for Prince at sold-out arenas across North America, and the dynamic between them had become impossible to ignore. The crew noticed it first, the way Prince's entire demeanor changed when Sheila was around. He smiled more. He joked with the band. He seemed less isolated, less locked inside his own head the way he usually was on tour. Sheila brought out something lighter in him, something more human. They started spending time together after shows, long conversations in hotel rooms or on the tour bus, talking about everything except music for once. Prince told her about growing up in Minneapolis, about the epilepsy he'd had as a child, about his parents' divorce, and the way he'd used music as a refuge. These weren't the kinds of conversations Prince usually had with people. He was famous for keeping his private life separate from his public persona, for never letting anyone get close enough to see the person behind the performance. But with Sheila, he felt safe. She wasn't trying to use him or profit from knowing him. She understood the cost of success because she was paying it herself. And somewhere in those late-night conversations, friendship transformed into something deeper, something that felt to Sheila like the most natural thing in the world, and to Prince like the most terrifying thing he'd ever encountered. The fabulous Forum in Inglewood, California, was packed wall-to-wall on February 23, 1985. Sheila E. had just finished her opening set when Prince took the stage for his own performance. Prince called Sheila back out, and instead of launching into another song, he started talking to the audience. He told them about discovering Sheila in Oakland, about how she'd changed his entire understanding of what rhythm could do, about how working with her had made him a better musician and a better person. And then Prince turned to face her fully, and he knelt down, and the entire arena seemed to hold its breath at exactly the same moment. He didn't have a ring. He didn't say the traditional words, but the gesture was unmistakable. And when Prince asked Sheila if she would marry him, the crowd's reaction was so loud that it physically hurt. Sheila felt tears streaming down her face before she even realized she was crying. And she heard herself say yes, heard her own voice amplified through the arena speakers. And then Prince was standing and hugging her, and the band was launching into The Glamorous Life, and confetti was falling from the ceiling, and the whole thing felt like a dream. like something too perfect to possibly be real. She'd loved Prince for months now, quietly and carefully, never quite sure if he felt the same way. But this was proof. This was him telling her and telling the world that she mattered, that what they had was real, that he was ready to commit to something permanent. The rest of the show was a blur. Sheila barely remembers playing, barely remembers the encores or the standing ovation. She was floating, completely untethered from reality, and when they finally got off stage 2 hours later, her hands were shaking so hard she couldn't hold her drumsticks. Prince disappeared almost immediately, the way he always did after shows, vanishing into some private dressing room to decompress alone. But Sheila didn't mind. She understood that he needed space, that performing at that level took everything out of him. She went back to her own dressing room, where her friends and crew were waiting with champagne and congratulations. And she spent the next few hours replaying the moment over and over in her head, trying to memorize every detail so she'd never forget what it felt like to have Prince Rogers Nelson propose to her in front of 17,000 witnesses. Morning came, and with it, a strange, hollow feeling that Sheila couldn't quite identify. She woke up in her hotel room with sunlight pouring through the curtains, and her mind immediately went to the proposal, expecting to feel that same rush of joy from the night before. But instead, there was just confusion. Because now that she thought about it in the cold light of day, Prince hadn't actually said he loved her. He'd talked about her talent, about their musical partnership, about how she'd changed his understanding of rhythm. But he'd never said the words that usually accompanied a marriage proposal. And there was no ring. She waited for him to call. The tour had a day off before the next show in San Diego, so there was time to talk, time to make plans. But her hotel phone stayed silent. She tried calling his room, but the front desk said he'd checked out early that morning without leaving a message. Today it felt like avoidance. By the time they all met up at the venue in San Diego for sound check, Sheila had convinced herself she was overreacting. She saw Prince immediately when she arrived, talking to his guitar technician, and she walked over expecting him to acknowledge what had happened, to pull her aside and talk about the proposal. But Prince just smiled at her, that same warm, knowing smile he always gave her, and asked if she was ready for tonight's show. No mention of the proposal. No reference to the fact that they were supposedly engaged now. Just business as usual. As if 17,000 people hadn't witnessed him kneel in front of her less than 24 hours ago. Sheila felt something crack inside her chest, a small fracture that she immediately tried to ignore. Nothing about this added up, and the more Sheila tried to rationalize it, the more confused she became. 2 days later, Sheila finally got her answer, and it came in the worst possible way. They were in Phoenix, third show of the week, and Sheila was in her dressing room getting ready when one of the backup singers knocked on her door. The woman looked uncomfortable, like she didn't want to be the one delivering whatever news she had. And when Sheila asked what was wrong, the singer hesitated before finally saying that Prince had been seen leaving a club the night before, with another woman, someone local, and that they'd gone back to his hotel together. Sheila felt the room tilt sideways. She asked the singer if she was sure, and the woman just nodded sadly. The show that night was the hardest performance of Sheila's entire career. She had to go out there and smile and play and pretend like her entire world hadn't just collapsed, had to watch Prince perform with that same charismatic energy he always brought. She could only feel confused and hurt and incredibly stupid for believing that a public proposal meant private commitment. After the show, Sheila finally confronted him, cornering him in the hallway outside his dressing room and demanding to know what was going on, what the proposal had actually meant, whether they were engaged or not. And Prince looked at her with those unreadable eyes and said something that would haunt Sheila for decades. He said the proposal was part of the show, that it was meant to create a moment for the audience, that he thought she'd understood that. He said he cared about her deeply, that she was one of the most important people in his life, but that he couldn't be tied down to one person. That his art required freedom and spontaneity and the ability to move through the world without constraints. Sheila heard the words, but they didn't make sense. How could a marriage proposal be part of a show? How could something that intimate and personal be reduced to performance art? She asked him if he'd ever meant it, if there had been any part of him that actually wanted to marry her. And Prince was silent for a long moment before saying that he meant every moment while it was happening, that the feeling was real even if the commitment wasn't. And that answer, somehow, made everything worse, because it meant he wasn't lying or manipulating her deliberately. It meant he genuinely saw the world differently than she did, that for him there was no clear line between performance and reality, between art and life. Everything was part of the same creative expression, and expecting permanence or traditional definitions was fundamentally misunderstanding who he was. Sheila stayed on the tour for another month, honoring her professional obligations even as the personal relationship dissolved into something strained and painful. They still performed together, still created magic on stage, but off stage there was a distance that hadn't existed before. Prince tried to maintain their friendship, but Sheila needed space. Years later, after Prince's death in 2016, Sheila would talk about that period of her life with a complicated mixture of gratitude and sadness. She'd say that loving Prince taught her important things about herself, about her own needs and boundaries, about the difference between admiring someone's genius and being able to build a life with them. She'd say that Prince was one of the most brilliant people she'd ever known, someone who genuinely saw music and art as more important than traditional relationships or conventional stability. And she'd say that wasn't wrong, it was just different, and that expecting him to operate within normal parameters was like expecting a hurricane to follow a straight line. The proposal hadn't been malicious. It had been, in Prince's mind, a genuine expression of what he felt in that moment. A creative gesture that captured the intensity of their connection without necessarily committing to the practical realities of marriage. He'd loved her the only way he knew how to love anyone, which was completely and intensely, but also temporarily, because his attention was always moving, always searching for the next sound, the next collaboration, the next creative possibility. Sheila had wanted permanence, and Prince had offered brilliance, and those two things weren't compatible no matter how much either of them wished they could be. Looking back from decades later, that February night in 1985 represents something larger than just a failed engagement. Sheila E. went on to have an extraordinary career, playing with everyone from Ringo Starr to Beyoncé, becoming one of the most respected percussionists in the world. She wrote her own music, built her own legacy, proved that she was never just Prince's protege, but always a force in her own right. The proposal was real in the moment it happened, but reality for Prince existed on stage. Sheila needed reality to extend beyond the stage. Neither approach was wrong. They were just incompatible. When Sheila E. tells this story now, she doesn't tell it with bitterness. She tells it with understanding, with the perspective that only time and experience can provide. She says that Prince gave her an incredible gift, even if it wasn't the gift she thought she was receiving that night at the Forum. He showed her what it meant to be completely committed to your art, to refuse to compromise your vision even when it cost you relationships and comfort and conventional happiness. Sheila decided she couldn't pay that price, and that decision probably saved her from a lifetime of trying to hold on to someone fundamentally ungraspable. She got to keep the music they made together, the memories of those creative sessions where everything clicked, the knowledge that for a brief moment she'd been the center of Prince's universe. And she got to walk away before trying to hold on destroyed what they'd built. The ring that never existed couldn't have symbolized what they had anyway. What they had was too big for rings, too complicated for traditional definitions, too intense to fit into the normal structures people use to contain love. It was a purple moment in time. Spectacular and brief and unforgettable. And maybe that's all it was ever meant to be.